Here's something that's really caught my eye recently. The CDC, their latest data from 2022.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
It shows 1 in 31 8-year-olds in the U.S. identified with autism spectrum disorder.
Wow. 1 in 31. That's a really significant number.
Right. It just tells you straight away, this is something we really need to understand better.
It absolutely does. And, what's interesting about that number isn't just how common it seems, but maybe also how much better we're getting at identifying it, how our understanding has kind of shifted.
Exactly. Things change. And that's what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
We've looked at a whole bunch of sources, historical stuff, scientific papers, health guidelines,
Right.
really trying to piece together the story of autism. Where did our ideas come from? What factors might be involved? And importantly, tackle some of those myths that just, won't seem to go away.
Yeah, there are definitely a few persistent ones.
So the goal here is pretty simple. Give you, our listener, a really clear, solid understanding of autism without, drowning you in technical terms.
Basically, lay out what autism is, how we got here in terms of understanding it, and maybe debunk a few things along the way. Give you that foundation.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then. What actually is autism spectrum disorder, ASD?
Well, the first thing to get straight is that it's a neurodevelopmental condition. Dr. Kaufman at the Cleveland Clinic put it really well, I think. He said, it's just the way your brain works.
I like that. Simple. It's not an illness.
Exactly. It's not a disease, not a mental illness in the usual sense. It's about how the brain develops, how it's wired, fundamentally.
And that word spectrum is super important too, right? I think Dr. Kaufman also said something like, when you meet one kid with autism, you've met one kid with autism.
That's it. It really drives home how diverse it is. There's no single look or presentation.
So it covers a wide range.
A very wide range. And the diagnostic criteria, especially since the DSM-5 came out, reflect that. They brought conditions that used to be separate diagnoses, like Asperger's syndrome or PDD-NOS,
Right.
all under that one ASD umbrella. And another key point, which the Cleveland Clinic highlights, is that ASD is something you're born with. It's part of your development from the start, unlike, say, depression or anxiety, which might develop later on.
Gotcha. That's a really useful distinction. Okay, so if that's what it is, how did we first start recognizing it? Let's rewind a bit.
Okay, history time. The first really detailed clinical accounts came from Leo Kanner back in 1943. He called it early infantile autism.
And what did he notice?
He described kids who seemed quite socially distant, sort of aloof, and really didn't like changes in their routines, very resistant to change.
And wasn't there someone else around the same time, Asperger?
That's right, Hans Asperger in 1944. He described individuals who had some similar traits, particularly the social difficulties, but often had, what seems like stronger language skills and cognitive abilities compared to Kanner's group.
Okay, so two early, slightly different descriptions. But then things took a really unfortunate turn with that refrigerator mother idea.
Ugh. Yes, that was, is a really harmful theory, popularized mainly by Bruno Bettelheim from the 50s into the 70s.
And the idea was?
The idea, completely baseless, was that autism was caused by mothers who were emotionally cold, distant, refrigerator-like.
Wow. That must have been devastating for parents.
Absolutely devastating. It placed so much blame and guilt on families, especially mothers who were already struggling, and it sent research down completely the wrong path for quite a while.
Just awful. So what started to turn that around? When did we move away from blaming parents?
Well, a couple of key figures stand out. Bernard Rimland, starting around 1964, did really important empirical work. He actually surveyed parents and found, no difference in parenting styles between parents of autistic kids and other parents.
So data challenging the myth.
Exactly. And around the same time, in the 60s, Michael Rutter's research was increasingly pointing towards a neurological basis for autism. So between them and others, the evidence started piling up against the refrigerator mother theory. By the late 70s, thankfully, the focus was shifting firmly towards neurobiology, towards the brain itself.
That's a relief, a major shift from blame to biology. Okay, so that brings us closer to the present, but there's another big controversy we absolutely have to address. The supposed link between vaccines and autism, specifically the MMR vaccine.
Right. This one is, it's frustrating because the science is so incredibly clear and yet the myth persists.
Really does. Where did it even start?
It traces back to one specific study published in 1998 in the Lancet Medical Journal by Andrew Wakefield.
The Wakefield study, I've heard of that.
Yeah, but here's the crucial part. That study was completely fraudulent. It was retracted by The Lancet in 2010. Investigations found serious ethical breaches, manipulated data.
Really? Manipulate?
Oh, yes. And Wakefield had undisclosed financial conflicts of interest he stood to gain from promoting alternative vaccines. Plus, as the Cleveland Clinic points out, he already had an ideological bias against the MMR vaccine.
So, bad science and hidden motives. Not a good combination.
Not at all. And since then, the scientific community has looked at this again and again and again.
Really?
Incredibly thoroughly. We're talking decades of research now. Huge studies, multiple types of studies, cohort studies following hundreds of thousands of kids over time, case control studies comparing kids with and without autism.
Right.
Ecological studies looking at population trends before and after MMR was introduced across different countries, UK, US, Denmark, Japan, Canada, Poland, you name it.
And the conclusion.
Always the same. Absolutely no link between the MMR vaccine and autism. None. Zero. A major review by DiStefano and Shimabukuro summarizes tons of this research. It's one of the most studied vaccine safety questions ever.
That seems incredibly definitive, yet, like you said, the belief lingers.
It does, unfortunately, and that misinformation has real-world consequences. Both the CDC and the Cleveland Clinic point this out. It leads to vaccine hesitancy, parents delaying or refusing vaccines.
Which puts kids at risk for diseases like measles.
Exactly. We've seen measles outbreaks directly linked to lowered vaccination rates fueled by this debunked fear.
And what do the big medical organizations say?
They are unequivocal. The Immunization Safety Review Committee looked at all the evidence and specifically said there's no reason to even review the MMR vaccine schedule regarding autism. The Infectious Diseases Society of America, IDSA, strongly backs vaccine safety and, frankly, gets frustrated that resources still have to be spent debunking this instead of focusing on actual autism research needs.
Okay, so message received. MMR vaccine does not cause autism. The science is settled. Crystal clear.
Crystal clear.
Right. Let's shift gears then. If it's not vaccines, what does influence the likelihood of autism? There's a lot of talk about environmental factors, isn't there? We've even heard recent comments from Secretary Kennedy on this.
Yes, that's come up recently. As of April 2025, Secretary Kennedy has been quite vocal, suggesting environmental toxins are, in his view, the main driver of rising autism rates. And he's mentioned wanting to look into things like mold in certain medicines.
Okay, so he's pointing towards environmental causes. How does that line up with the current science?
Well, it's important to be clear here. His specific claims, particularly blaming toxins as the primary cause for the increase in diagnoses, don't align with the established scientific consensus.
But science does acknowledge environmental factors can play some role, right? It's not all genetics.
Absolutely. It's not all genetics, though genetics plays a very significant part. Research, like the paper on environmental factors influencing the risk of autism and info from Autism Speaks, has identified several environmental factors associated with an increased risk.
Oh, like what kind of factors?
Things like advanced parental age, especially the father's age. Maternal health during pregnancy is also important. Conditions like schizophrenia, significant depression or anxiety, certain immune system disorders, obesity or diabetes in the mother. Also, exposure to certain things during pregnancy, like heavy air pollution or some pesticides. And then factors around birth itself, being born extremely prematurely, very low birth weight, or complications that might lead to oxygen deprivation.
That Iranian study you mentioned about paternal age was striking too.
Yeah, finding a nearly 30% increased risk for every 10-year increase in dad's age over 29. It highlights how complex these influences can be.
So there are definitely environmental risk factors, but they interact with genetics. How does that work?
That's the million-dollar question, really. We know autism has a strong genetic component, but the environment seems to influence how those genes get expressed. It's this field called epigenetics.
Epigenetics. Like switches for genes.
Sort of, yeah. Environmental factors might not change the underlying DNA code, but they can affect whether certain genes are turned on or off or how active they are. It's a really complex interplay.
Okay, so genetics plus environmental risk factors influencing gene expression. That makes sense. But what about this idea of an autism epidemic? We hear that phrase a lot. Is it accurate?
Epidemic is probably not the right word, and it can be alarming. Yes, diagnoses have gone up significantly. But as places like the Cleveland Clinic and Autism Speaks explain, most experts believe this increase is largely due to other things, not some sudden environmental cause creating way more autism.
Like what other things?
Well, much greater public and professional awareness. Doctors are just better at recognizing it now. The diagnostic criteria themselves changed with the DSM-5, becoming broader, including more people under the ASD umbrella.
So the definition expanded.
Exactly. And rules changed, allowing co-diagnosis with things like ADHD, which wasn't always the case. If you look at older prevalence studies, like those mentioned by the National Autistic Society from the 60s, 70s, 80s, the rates varied a lot depending on how they defined autism and how hard they looked for cases.
So it's more that we're finding and counting it differently and more broadly.
That seems to be the main driver, yes. Better detection, broader definition, more awareness, not necessarily a huge surge in the underlying condition caused by toxins, as Secretary Kennedy suggests.
Okay, that context is really important for understanding those rising numbers. Now, moving beyond causes and risk factors, there's an interesting alternative theory about the actual experience of autism, neurologically speaking, this intense world syndrome.
Ah, yes, that's a fascinating hypothesis. It was proposed back in 2007 by Henry and Camilla Markram.
And what's the core idea behind it?
Instead of seeing autism primarily as a collection of deficits, the intense world theory suggests it might stem from, well, an overly intense processing of the world. Hyperreactivity, hyperplasticity in the brain's local circuits.
So the brain is almost too connected, too sensitive.
In a way, yes. The idea is that the neural microcircuits are hyperfunctional, leading to excessive information processing. The world might feel overwhelming, incredibly intense, leading to sensory overload.
That could explain things like sensory sensitivities or withdrawal, maybe?
Potentially, yes. It reframes some autistic behaviors not as deficits, but as coping mechanisms for an overwhelming internal experience. It's a shifting perspective from deficit to perhaps overabundance at a micro level.
Is there actual research backing this up?
There is. The Markram's group has done research, often using a specific rat model where exposure to valproic acid in utero induces autism-like traits. They've found evidence of altered microcircuits, including signs of hyperconnectivity and hyperreactivity in these models.
Hyperconnectivity.
Yeah, suggesting these local brain circuits might become almost too efficient, too focused, maybe making it harder for different brain regions to coordinate smoothly on a larger scale. They've also noted some related structural findings in humans, too. It's an ongoing area of research.
Very interesting. A different way to conceptualize what might be happening in the brain. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. History, definitions, controversies, potential factors, even alternative theories. As we wrap up, what are the absolute key things you want our listeners to take away?
I think first, remember, autism is a neurodevelopmental condition. It's about brain development, influenced by a mix of genetics and environmental risk factors. Second, the vaccine link, especially MMR. It's been thoroughly conclusively debunked. Vaccines don't cause autism.
Right. Crucial point.
And third, our understanding is still evolving. Theories like the intense world syndrome show we're constantly learning more, trying to understand the diverse experiences of autistic people better.
Absolutely. And hopefully, for everyone listening, this deep dive has helped cut through some of the noise, offering a clearer, more balanced picture of autism, where our understanding came from, what the science actually says, and where things might be heading.
Yeah, hopefully you feel a bit more grounded in the facts now.
Which leads to maybe a final thought for everyone to mull over. Given everything we've discussed, the rising identification rates, the complex causes, the ongoing research, what do you think is the most important thing we should focus on next? Is it more research into causes, better support systems, shifting societal attitudes?
That's a great question to leave people with. Where should the priority lie moving forward? There's certainly a lot to consider.
Definitely something to think about. And if you want to explore any of this further, check out the resources from organizations like Autism Speaks or the National Autistic Society. They have a wealth of information. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.